I never believed in ghosts. Not really. Sure, I had heard the stories, whispers of restless spirits that roamed the earth, seeking vengeance or solace, but they were always just that. Stories. Fantasies spun to entertain children or to frighten the curious. I was always the pragmatic one, the one who laughed at ghost tales and dismissed them as superstitions. I never thought that one day I would find myself in a place where those stories might be more than just stories. But here I am, in the remote village of Aokigahara, sitting in an old, decaying house, waiting for something I can't explain to happen. I had come to Aokigahara to escape. My life in Tokyo had fallen apart, and I needed to disappear. The city had suffocated me, and I longed for silence, for peace, for a place where I could breathe without the constant pressure of expectations. I had lost my job in a corporate firm after a series of mistakes I couldn't undo, and my personal life was no better. I had hurt the people I loved, and they had hurt me in return. It was easier to leave, to start over somewhere no one knew my name. When I saw the ad for a caretaker position in Aokigahara, I didn't hesitate. It seemed like the perfect opportunity. The house was cheap, secluded, and the job was simple. Maintain the property, keep it clean, and make sure nothing fell into disrepair. The village was small and the people were quiet. I could already picture it. Long, solitary days spent in the company of books and my own thoughts. No one to judge me. No one to remind me of my failures. The house was older than I had expected, built in the traditional style with wooden beams and sliding paper doors. It had an air of faded grandeur, as though it had once been a proud, lively home, but had since been left to wither. The walls were lined with dark, weathered wood, and the floors creaked beneath my feet as I explored each room. Dust settled in the corners, and the air smelled musty, but there was a strange charm to the place. It felt like stepping back in time, like I was living in a different era. At first, the days were peaceful. I spent my mornings cleaning, my afternoons reading, and my evenings cooking simple meals for myself. The silence was comforting. There was something about the isolation that made me feel safe, as if I could finally exhale after years of suffocating in the city. But it wasn't long before I began to notice that the house wasn't as quiet as it seemed. It started with the smallest things. A creak in the floorboards when I was sure I was alone. A door that seemed to shift slightly, as though it had been opened and closed without my noticing. I told myself it was just the house settling, the natural sounds of an old building. But then, one evening, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I was in the attic, sorting through boxes of old furniture and forgotten trinkets, when I found the portrait. It was hidden behind a stack of dusty old boxes, wedged between a broken lamp and a cracked mirror. The frame was old, its wood chipped and faded, but the painting inside was striking. The woman in the portrait had long, flowing black hair and dark eyes that seemed to stare straight at me. Her expression was unreadable, calm, almost serene, but there was something unsettling about it. Her gaze seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, and for a moment I felt a shiver crawl up my spine. I couldn't explain why, but I felt an immediate unease. It wasn't just the way her eyes seemed to track my movements. It was something deeper, something that gnawed at me from the inside. I didn't know who she was, but I had the distinct feeling that she was not someone I wanted to meet. That night, I decided to visit the village library. The small building was tucked away at the end of a narrow street, its shelves lined with old books and dusty volumes. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Nakamura, greeted me with a warm smile, but there was something in her eyes that made me uneasy. She seemed to be studying me, as if trying to place me. "You're staying in the Kuroda house, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I nodded, surprised that she knew. The village was small, but I hadn't expected people to know so much about me so quickly. "That house has a history," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A tragic history. You should be careful, child." I raised an eyebrow, half expecting her to say something about the house being old or in disrepair, but her words took me by surprise. What do you mean? The house is fine. She hesitated, glancing around the room as though making sure no one was listening. It's not the house that's the problem. It's the spirit that haunts it. Oiwa. I frowned, confused. Oiwa? Mrs. Nakamura nodded solemnly. Oiwa was the wife of the Kuroda family's patriarch. She was beautiful, beloved by all who knew her, but her husband, driven by jealousy and paranoia, poisoned her. Slowly, painfully. He couldn't bear her beauty, her power over him. He feared she would leave him, so he killed her. I felt a chill creep down my spine as she spoke. And what happened to her? She didn't die quietly, Mrs. Nakamura said, her voice barely a whisper. Her spirit returned, vengeful and angry. She haunts the house to this day, seeking revenge on anyone who dares to stay there. Her face was destroyed by the poison, twisted and disfigured. They say she can still be seen in the mirrors in the shadows, watching, waiting. I laughed nervously, not sure how to respond. That sounds like an old ghost story. Mrs. Nakamura didn't smile. It's not a story, child, it's the truth. I didn't know what to say. I had come to Aokigahara for peace, for a fresh start. I wasn't looking for ghosts or curses, but as I walked back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The next few days were uneventful, but the unease in the house grew. The silence was oppressive, thick with something I couldn't name. The shadows in the corners of the rooms seemed to stretch longer, as if they were reaching for me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being followed, like someone or something was always just behind me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining things. The house was old after all. Old houses creaked and groaned. But then, one evening as I sat in the living room, I heard it. A soft sound like a whisper coming from the hallway. At first I thought it was the wind or the house settling, but then it came again. Faint, clear. My name. Ayame. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I looked around the room, my breath catching in my throat. There was no one there. The house was still. The air was thick with silence, but the whisper remained, echoing in my mind. Ayame. I stood up, my legs trembling. The voice was so soft, so faint, but it was unmistakable. It was calling my name. I stepped into the hallway, my pulse racing. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering candle in the living room. I walked cautiously down the hall, my footsteps muffled by the old wooden floors. The air felt colder here, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I reached the end of the hall, but there was no one there, no sign of anything out of place. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. I was imagining things. The house was old, and the sounds it made could play tricks on anyone's mind. But the whisper had been so real, so clear. That night I couldn't sleep. The whispers haunted me, echoing in the corners of my mind. Ayame. It was as if the voice was calling from inside the walls, urging me to listen, to understand. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The house felt different, as if it were alive, watching me. I went back to the attic to check the portrait again, but when I looked at it, the woman's eyes seemed to be watching me more intently than before. Her smile, once serene, now looked almost mocking, as though she knew something I didn't. That's when I realized. Oiwa wasn't just a story. She was real. And she had come for me. The whispers grew louder. I would hear them in the night, in the silence, calling my name. Ayame. They were no longer soft and distant. They were urgent, demanding. And then, one night, I saw her. It was an exceptionally chilly evening. I had just changed into my pajamas and was about to go to bed. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was even worse. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As I reached to close the curtains, the air grew thick with a coldness that seemed to seep into my bones. I stood frozen, unable to move, my heart pounding in my chest. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long, curling toward me like tendrils of darkness, pulling me closer to the heart of whatever presence lingered in the house. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow, too dark to be natural, slipping between the beams of the ceiling. I turned, my body stiff with dread, and there she was. Oiwa! I couldn't breathe. My chest constricted as my eyes locked onto her figure. She stood in the doorway just beyond the dim glow of the candlelight, her form shrouded in the darkness. Her silhouette was tall, almost too tall, and impossibly thin, as though she had been stretched beyond the limits of the human body. Her hair hung in long, tangled strands around her face, black as midnight but matted and stiff, like something dead. It clung to her face, framing it in a way that made my stomach churn. But it was her face, oh God, her face, that made my blood run cold. Her features were a mass of scar tissue, grotesque and swollen, as though her skin had been melted and stitched back together in a cruel mockery of its former self. The once beautiful contours of her face were now warped beyond recognition, twisted by the poison that had killed her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched too tight over the bones beneath, and her lips, if they could even be called lips, were cracked and torn like dried leather. The edges of her mouth were pulled into a grotesque, unnatural grin, the corners of her lips curling upward in a way that was both mocking and horrific. Her eyes were the worst part. Black, empty voids that seemed to suck the light from the room. They were hollow, unblinking, and as I stared into them, I felt as though I were falling into an abyss. And then she moved, slowly, deliberately, her body jerking as though each step caused her great pain. The sound of her movements was a sickening crackling, like dry leaves being crushed underfoot, or the snap of bone as she dragged herself forward. She reached for me, and I could feel the coldness of her presence before her hand even touched me. It was an icy, unnatural cold, the kind that seeped into your skin and froze your blood. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs were paralyzed. My body refused to obey. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, turned to lead, and I was trapped, unable to move, unable to escape. Her fingers brushed against my arm, and the coldness that radiated from her touch was unlike anything I had ever felt. It was as though the very life was being drained from me, like a shadow had fallen over my soul. Her skin, if it could even be called skin, was like ice, smooth and unyielding. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, my breath shallow and ragged, but no sound escaped my lips. I was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. The room seemed to spin, the walls closing in around me as her face drew closer, her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Her grin widened, stretching farther than any human face could possibly go, and I saw the remnants of teeth, sharp and yellowed, glinting in the candlelight. Ayame. Her voice was a low, guttural whisper, like the sound of dry leaves scraping across the ground. It was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. My name. She knew me. She had come for me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to break free from her gaze, but my body refused to move. My muscles were frozen, locked in place by an invisible force. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by fear, my heart thundering in my ears as she slowly, inexorably, reached out to touch my face. The coldness was unbearable. It felt like ice had been pressed against my skin, a sharp, biting chill that numbed my entire body. The sensation was so intense that it felt as though my skin was being ripped away, as though I were being frozen from the inside out. Her face was so close now that I could smell the decay on her breath. Sour, rancid, like rotting flesh. It was the smell of death, the smell of something long dead but unwilling to let go. Her grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as she leaned in closer. "You will pay," she whispered again, her voice like the crackling of dry wood in a fire, "for the sins of your bloodline." My heart stuttered, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. I gasped, but no sound came out. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, Oiwa was gone. The room was empty, silent once more. The coldness lingered in the air, but she was no longer there. I was alone, but I knew it wasn't over. She had marked me, she had touched me, and whatever curse she carried, whatever vengeance she sought, it was now mine to bear. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I was no longer sure of anything. One thing was certain, though. Oiwa had come for me, and now there was no turning back. I couldn't just stay in the house and do nothing. I couldn't just wait to die. I needed to find a way to lift the curse. The village library had been of little help, but Mrs. Nakamura's warnings about Oiwa's curse had stayed with me. She had mentioned an exorcist, a man named Kaito, who lived on the outskirts of the village. She spoke of him in hushed tones, but I had no choice. If there was any chance of freeing myself from Oiwa's vengeful spirit, I had to seek him out. The path to Kaito's home was long and winding, cutting through dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. The air grew colder as I walked, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig sent my heart racing. But I pressed on, determined to find the man who could save me. When I finally arrived at his modest home, I was greeted by an old, weathered man with deep-set eyes that seemed to see through me. His gaze was piercing, unnerving, and I felt a chill run down my spine as he studied me. "You seek my help," he said, his voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. I nodded, too frightened to speak. I had no words to explain the terror that had taken over my life. The haunting, the whispers, the cold touch of Oiwa's hand. It was all too much to bear. "I need you to help me," I finally managed to say, my voice trembling. I'm being haunted by a spirit, a woman named Oiwa." Kaito's expression remained unchanged, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or something darker. He motioned for me to sit. "Oiwa," he murmured, as if tasting the name on his tongue. "Her story is well known, but few understand the full depth of her curse." I swallowed hard. "Please, you must help me. I can't live like this anymore." Kaito was silent for a long time, his eyes studying me intently. Finally, he spoke. "Her spirit is not just a ghost," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "Oiwa's vengeance is tied to the sins of the past, sins that have been passed down through the generations. She was betrayed by her husband, but it was not just him who wronged her. The Kuroda family, your family, played a part in her death, and now she seeks retribution." I felt my heart drop into my stomach. "What do you mean? I don't understand. My family didn't—" Kaito held up a hand to silence me. "The Kuroda family's bloodline is cursed, Ayame. Your great-grandfather was the one who betrayed her spirit in a past life. He was the one who caused her suffering, and his actions have rippled through the generations. The sins of the past are not easily erased. They linger, waiting for the right moment to strike." I trembled, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a heavy stone. "But I didn't do anything. I didn't even know about her. How can I be responsible?" Kaito's gaze softened, but there was no pity in his eyes. "You are a part of the bloodline, Ayame. You cannot escape what has been set in motion. Oiwa's spirit manifests through the unresolved grievances of the past. She is not just a ghost. She is a manifestation of the guilt, the betrayal, and the suffering that your ancestors caused her. And now, it is your turn to face it." I trembled, the weight of his words pressing down on me like a heavy stone. "But how can I stop her?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "How can I break the curse?" Kaito looked at me with a mixture of sadness and resignation. The only way to break the curse is to confront it. You must face the truth of your family's dark history. Only then will Oiwa's spirit be able to rest. You must make amends for the wrongs that were done, even if those wrongs were committed long before you were born. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I had no idea what Kaito meant by facing the truth, but I knew one thing: I couldn't do this alone. I had to learn the truth about my family, about the sins that had been committed, and somehow I had to make it right. Kaito gave me a small wooden talisman, carved with symbols I didn't understand. "Take this," he said. "It will protect you from Oiwa's wrath, but only if you are truly willing to face the past. If you cannot, if you try to run from it, the curse will claim you." I didn't hesitate. I took the talisman, clutching it tightly in my hand, and set off back to the house. The weight of Kaito's words hung over me like a storm cloud, and I knew that I had to uncover the truth. I had no choice. I spent the next few days poring over old family records, letters, and journals, anything I could find that might shed light on the dark history Kaito had mentioned. The more I dug, the more I uncovered. Stories of betrayal, jealousy, and deceit that stretched back generations. My great-grandfather had been a wealthy man, a man of power and influence in the village, but he had also been a man consumed by greed and fear. It was said that he had once been in love with a beautiful woman, a woman named Oiwa. But when he grew paranoid, convinced that she would leave him for another man, he poisoned her, slowly and painfully. But it wasn't just the act of betrayal that had doomed him. It was the way he had treated her spirit after her death. He had refused to honor her memory, had tried to bury her name, and in doing so, he had cursed his bloodline forever. I felt a sickening sense of horror as I read the final letter my great-grandfather had written before his death. It was a confession, a final admission of his guilt. He had known what he had done, and he had tried to make amends in the only way he knew how, by erasing Oiwa from history. But in doing so, he had condemned not just himself, but his descendants. I understood now. Oiwa's spirit was not just a ghost. She was the embodiment of all the pain, the suffering, and the injustice that had been done to her. And her vengeance wasn't just about revenge, it was about making her story known, about forcing the Kuroda family to face the truth of their past. I knew what I had to do. I had to return to the house, to the place where the curse had begun, and confront Oiwa's spirit. I had to acknowledge the wrongs of the past and give Oiwa the justice she had been denied for so long. That night, I stood in the center of the living room, the talisman clutched tightly in my hand. The air was thick with tension, the house silent except for the soft creak of the floorboards beneath my feet. I could feel her presence, the weight of her anger pressing down on me. And then she appeared. Oiwa's face was as twisted and deformed as ever, but this time there was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, consuming rage. She reached for me, her fingers like claws, and I could feel the coldness of her touch as she closed the distance between us. But this time, I didn't run. I didn't try to escape. I stood my ground. "Oiwa," I said, my voice trembling but steady. "I know what my great-grandfather did to you. I know the pain and the suffering he caused. I am sorry. I cannot undo what has been done, but I can honor your memory. I can tell your story. I can make sure that you are never forgotten." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The air was thick with anticipation, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Oiwa's eyes bore into me, searching for something I couldn't understand. And then, slowly, her expression softened. The rage in her eyes began to fade, replaced by something else, something that almost resembled peace. Her form began to dissipate, the shadows around her melting away like mist in the morning sun. The coldness that had filled the room lifted, and for the first time since I had arrived in Aokigahara, I felt a sense of calm. Oiwa's spirit had been set free. The curse was broken. I never saw Oiwa again after that night. The house, once heavy with her presence, became quiet. peaceful even. I stayed in Aokigahara for a time, finishing the work I had started and honoring the memory of the woman whose spirit had tormented me. But I knew that my life would never be the same. The past, the sins of my family had been laid bare, and I had faced them. And in doing so, I had freed myself from the curse. But I would never forget the price of that freedom.